Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and I have a brief presentation to make on Origen and the Alexandrians, and the King James Version of the Bible. KJV onlyists will often point to Alexandria as being a bad place, and they will remind people that in Scripture, what we read of the Alexandrians is this: Then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines, and Cyrenians, and Alexandrians, and of them of Cilicia and of Asia, disputing with Stephen. And people say, look, the Alexandrians are people who are disputing with Stephen. Therefore, they must be bad. And, this is a scripture that definitely paints them in that light. However, to say that everything that comes out of Alexandria must be bad is to paint with a very broad brush. And even Scripture doesn't necessarily do that itself. For example, there was an early disciple whose name was Apollos, who came from, you guessed it, Alexandria. This is what Scripture records of him. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. So what is it that Scripture actually records about Alexandria? Well, in some cases there were people who were anti-Christian. They were disputing with Stephen. But then there are other people who are mighty in the Scriptures, not people who doubt God, but people who are instructed in the way of the Lord and do their best to represent Him and represent Him well. People who teach diligently the things of the Lord is how Scripture records it. So, since Scripture presents Alexandria as a source of both good and bad, it's not just bad in Scripture, but it's a source of both good and bad, it behooves us to evaluate those who were from Alexandria on the basis of what they actually believed, rather than on the basis of where they lived or were from. That is, we're going to talk about the Alexandrian fathers and see what these people actually thought regarding Scripture. First one that we're going to talk about is Clement of Alexandria. He said, "But those who are ready to toil in the most excellent pursuits will not desist from the search after truth till they get the demonstration from the Scriptures themselves. For we have, as the source of teaching, the Lord, both by the prophets, the gospel, and the blessed apostles, in divers manners and at sundry times, leading from the beginning of knowledge to the end. But if one should suppose that another origin was required, then no longer truly could an origin be preserved. Accordingly, those fall from this eminence who follow not God whither He leads, and He leads us in the Scriptures." Clement's view of Scripture seems to be remarkably high, a lot like a lot of modern Protestants. What does he say? He says that Scripture is the source of teaching. It is what leads from the beginning of knowledge to its end. And how is it that God leads us? He leads us in the Scriptures. This is the kind of people that Christian Alexandria produced, and this is something that a lot of KJV onlyists forget, that Alexandria very quickly became a Christian place. In fact, one of the most influential sees of Christianity early on was Alexandria, Egypt. The Christians, in a lot of ways, basically took it over. And so a lot of Christian thought or originated there in a lot of ways. Of course, ultimately all Christian thought originates with God, but as far as executing it and living it out, and actually a lot of the same principles that we ourselves as Protestants would adhere to, we find typecast in a lot of the Alexandrian fathers. Clement is one of them. Here's another one that the KJV onlyists love to tear apart, is Origen. And Origen has been branded as a heretic by both the Eastern Orthodox and by the Catholics. And so he must be a really, really, really bad guy. But at the same time, a heretic, according to the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, might not be such a bad thing. After all, Protestants are considered heretics according to the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, which probably means that at least some of what Origen believed actually might not be all that different from our own. That doesn't mean that everything he believed was necessarily orthodox and correct, but there are some things that are probably worth taking a look at. For example, this is one of the things that Origen said. He said, "Therefore, in proof of all the words we utter when teaching, we ought to produce the doctrine of Scripture as confirming the doctrine we utter. For, as all the gold that is without the temple is not sanctified, so every doctrine that is not in the divine Scripture, although it may seem admirable to some, is not sacred, because it is not comprehended within the doctrine of Scripture, which sanctifies that doctrine alone which it contains within itself, as the temple does the gold that is in it." That sounds like someone who has a very high view of Scripture. Scripture sanctifies that doctrine alone which it contains within itself. That is an amazing statement. And he even says that doctrines, although they may seem admirable to some, if they're not contained in Scripture, they're not sacred. That's a really strong statement of the power and the authority of Scripture. Theonas of Alexandria. Here's one of the things he said. He said, "My dearest Lucianus, let no day pass by without reading some portion of the sacred Scriptures, at such convenient hour as offers, and giving some space to meditation. And never cast off the habit of reading in the Holy Scriptures, for nothing feeds the soul and enriches the mind so well as those sacred studies do." Did you hear that? Nothing feeds the soul and enriches the mind so well. That's a very high view of Scripture. Found in Alexandria, of all places. Athanasius of Alexandria, a very important figure in church history. He said, "We have made mention of the heretics as dead, but of ourselves as possessing the divine Scriptures for salvation." What is one of the key differences that Athanasius would list against as distinguishing between heretics and people who have true Christianity? Well, one of them is that we actually have the divine Scriptures and they don't. We possess something that they don't, and we regard it, whereas they can't because they don't have it. That is someone who has a very high view of Scripture. Oh, and by the way, it was Athanasius who first listed the canon of the New Testament as we have it today. He didn't create it, of course. The New Testament canon was well known before we get to Athanasius, but he is the one who sent out a festal epistle, I believe it was like 367 AD, sent it abroad basically throughout the Roman Empire to declare to everyone, hey, this is what the church receives. He was describing the normal process in the church, what was considered Scripture in the church, so that people would know what was authentic and what wasn't. He was someone who cared very deeply about Scripture and making sure that people understood what was Scripture and what wasn't, because it was important, because it was vital. Why? It's because it's divine Scripture from which we get the message of salvation. It is our primary witness into the history of Christ. It is what testifies to us. It is the word that speaks to us. It's important that we get it right. And Athanasius cared about getting it right. Now, it is often claimed that the New Testament of the KJV does not come from Alexandria, and that it isn't based on an eclectic text. That is, a lot of times KJV onlyists will say, well, if a text comes from Alexandria, it's bad, and that eclectic text where you're picking from all of these different text types and whatnot, that's just a bad idea. You need one textual tradition, one thing that shows that it's all right. And they'll say, of course, the King James is pure. It's not Alexandrian, and it's definitely not one of those weird, evil, eclectic texts. But here's the problem. If you actually examine the primary 16 manuscripts that were used to create the New Testament of the KJV, now technically the KJV translators actually used printed editions, but those printed editions, of course, had to come from somewhere, and they came from 16 primary manuscripts, couple dozen total, but 16 primary ones. If you look at those, you will immediately notice that many of them actually have Alexandrian readings. And there's actually Alexandrian readings in the King James. But a lot of King James onlyists don't actually know what an Alexandrian reading is, and so they don't know one when they see it. And also you'll notice that they are eclectic. They do not come from a single textual tradition. So, for example, D is one of the manuscripts, and it's a Western text. It's not even a majority text. It's not Byzantine. It's a Western text. That is, of the text type that eventually was used by Roman Catholicism. There's also manuscript L that was used in creating the New Testament of the KJV, and guess what? It's Alexandrian and Byzantine. There are some parts where it switches back and forth. That is very interesting, and actually because of that, the KJV does actually have some Alexandrian readings in it because of that. Manuscript 1 is an interesting manuscript because it's Caesarean. Caesarean manuscripts are manuscripts that can be traced one way or another back to Origen. And in fact, there are some readings in the King James that you can trace pretty much directly back to Origen. Manuscripts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all Byzantine. But of course, the King James text itself isn't actually Byzantine because it includes all of these other little things. Manuscript 7 is Alexandrian and Byzantine. Because of that, you do get a couple of extra Alexandrian readings in the King James from time to time because of that, because it was based on manuscripts that did have Alexandrian readings in them. Manuscripts 8, 9, 8, 17, and 28, 14 are all Byzantine texts. They all follow along with the majority. But manuscript 2815 is Caesarean and Byzantine. That again, it goes back to Origen. 2816 is a very important manuscript for the King James, in that Erasmus actually based his editions. These are the very first editions of the Textus Receptus to come out. He based his editions very heavily on this manuscript and a few others. And 2816 is interesting because it has readings all over the place. It has some readings that are Alexandrian, some of them that are Byzantine, and even some of them that are Western. It is all over in all kinds of weirdness. It's definitely an eclectic text, and it was used to create the King James. And then there's also manuscript 2817, which is a Byzantine text. But in these, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of variety. A lot of them, the good majority of them, are Byzantine. But there are ones that do not follow along with that. There are ones that include Alexandrian readings and Caesarean readings and Western readings, so on and so forth. That is, the King James New Testament is based on an eclectic text, just like a lot of the modern translations are based on eclectic texts. The only difference is that the King James translators only had about 7 printed editions available to them, and those 7 printed editions were based on these 16 primary manuscripts and only about 24 manuscripts total. Whereas modern translators who use the same principle of eclecticism, choosing the best reading after examining all of the evidence, the difference is that modern textual critics don't have just a couple of dozen manuscripts available to them. Instead, they have over 5,700. They have a lot more information at their fingertips than the KJV translators ever had. And because of that, we can say with a much higher degree of confidence than the King James translators could that the New Testament as we have it now is incredibly accurate. In fact, as a testimony to this, an interesting thing to note has been places where textual scholars have looked at the New Testament and have provided conjectural emendations. And what's interesting is a lot of the critical editions that have come out, especially the Nestle-Aland critical editions, is that the number of conjectural emendations has been going down. And in the 28th edition, the last edition to come out, they actually took out the conjectural emendations completely. Not because they didn't necessarily think that there wasn't any, anything to be gained by looking at them, but simply because there really isn't much of a need for conjectural emendation anymore. Where we only had a few manuscripts to begin with, yeah, you will sometimes have to figure out how the text goes together, and you're going to make some conjectural emendations. For example, Theodore Beza did such in Revelation 16:5. And he put in a reading in Revelation 16:5 that you find in the King James that you do not find in any other manuscript. You do not find it in any New Testament manuscript at all for Revelation 16:5. But Beza made a conjectural emendation. He was trying to figure out things as best he could. However, most modern translations, and especially ones that are made by a committee, made by people who are truly experts in the field, and actually made to reflect the text, be fairly formal about it, they don't have to make conjectural emendations. They have a lot more evidence. And even some of the staunchest critics of the New Testament, like Bart Ehrman and them, have admitted that the need for conjectural emendation in the New Testament text is now reduced to the smallest dimensions possible. And even in places where they might propose them, they have to admit that the conjectural emendation isn't all that likely. We're in a much better place now than we used to be. And we're still using the same basic principles. That is, you gather the manuscripts that you have available to you, all of the different readings that are available to you, and you choose from the vast based on the best evidence that you have, and you go with that. That hasn't changed. What it has changed is people's opinion about it. Whereas people at one time understood that ancient texts varied, and it doesn't mean that the faith varies, but there's a certain amount of flexibility that the biblical textual tradition has always had, that Christians were always pretty much just fine with, for the most part. There's a reason why we were okay with translating the scripture into different languages and all of these kinds of things. Fluidity, giving it to people, it's a good thing. And it's only in periods where that has been restricted that bad things have happened in Christianity to a large extent. Anyways, I've gone on in this slide a lot longer than I needed to. I apologize for that, but hopefully you get the point. The claim that Alexandria is bad is just simply ludicrous. Okay, the Bible itself doesn't point to Alexandria as being solely bad. There are good things that came out of Alexandria in the Bible. The claim that all of the Alexandrian church fathers were just these evil people who are cutting up the Bible and trying to make it into whatever they wanted it to just isn't borne out in the history. The Alexandrian fathers, out of pretty much any of the early influential sees of Christianity, were actually probably the ones that were the most defensive about defending the power and authority of Scripture over and against Rome, over and against Constantinople and these other groups. And then finally, the claim that the KJV itself isn't Alexandrian is completely false. The KJV does have Alexandrian readings in it, and it is indeed an eclectic text. King James onlyism, in this particular regard at least, this claim about Alexandria, is just completely false. There is no support for it whatsoever. You can look at any of the areas that we've talked about here, and you can verify everything that I say. The Bible does talk about good things coming from Alexandria. The church fathers of Alexandria actually were major proponents of the authority of Scripture. And the KJV does have Alexandrian readings in it, and it is indeed eclectic. All of the information's there. King James onlyism is just not historically, biblically, or even factually defensible at all. I'm not trying to necessarily pick a fight in that regard, but it's just the simple truth. Anyways, I hope you guys hear my heart in this, that I'm trying to speak the truth and represent what Christianity has been for 2,000 years. This is not a personal attack. This is just simply defending what it is and what the truth is, and searching for the truth. Go with God and be blessed.